In this lecture, I'm going to talk about essentials of hypothesis testing. What is a statistical hypothesis? It's a statement, report, or claim regarding a characteristic of one or more population parameters. What is a hypothesis testing? It's a process that uses sample statistics based on sample evidence and probability to test the claim about the value of a population parameter. What's a null hypothesis? It's a statistical hypothesis that contains a statement of equality, such as less than or equal to, greater than or equal to, or simply just equal. It is common to use HO to show null hypothesis. Now, what is an alternative hypothesis? Alternative hypothesis is the complement of the null hypothesis and must contain a statement of inequality, such as greater than, less than, or not equal to. Now, it's common to use H1 to show alternative hypothesis, but sometimes we can also use HA for alternative hypothesis. When doing hypothesis testing, there are always possibilities of making errors. What is type 1 error? Type 1 error is when a true null hypothesis is rejected. What about type 2 error? Type 2 error is when a false null hypothesis is actually supported. How many outcomes are there from hypothesis testing? There are 4 possible outcomes from any hypothesis testing. Here are the 4 outcomes of testing. If the null hypothesis is true and we support it, that would be a correct decision. But when the null hypothesis is true, but we reject it, that would be type 1 error. Now, on the other hand, if HO is false and we support HO, we're supporting a false statement. That would be type 2 error. But when we reject the null hypothesis when it's false, that means we're making a correct decision. What's the significance level? Significance level is the probability of making type 1 error. We use the Greek letter alpha, where alpha is some number between 0 and 1. So what are the probabilities of making errors? Probability that we make type 1 error is alpha, and probability of making type 2 error would be 1 minus alpha. What are the main keywords when doing hypothesis testing? anything that implies equality, that becomes the null hypothesis, such as equal to, exactly, greater than equal to, at least, not less than or equal to, at most, or not more than. These are some common keywords for the null hypothesis. Now, on the other hand, for the alternative hypothesis, anything that shows inequality, that would be alternative hypothesis, such as not equal to, different, less than, below, fewer, greater than, above, more than. These are some of the examples of keywords for the alternative hypothesis. What are the testing types? There are 3 testing types when performing hypothesis testing: the two-tailed test, the left-tailed test, and the right-tailed test. The two-tailed test is when the alternative hypothesis is not equal to. The left-tailed test is when the alternative hypothesis is strictly less than. In other words, the arrow is pointing to the left. And the right-tailed test is when the alternative hypothesis is pointing to the right. Drawing and labeling testing types. For the two-tailed test, you take the significance level alpha and you divide it by 2. Half will go to the right and the other half will go to the left. Those regions are called critical region, and the rest of the graph will be non-critical region. The value that separates critical and non-critical regions from each other, those are called critical values. In the critical region, H1, the alternative hypothesis, will be valid. In the non-critical region, the null hypothesis will be valid. For the right-tailed test, alpha will be the area of the critical region on the right-hand side of the graph. The value that separates the critical region from the non-critical region is called critical value. In the critical region, H1 will be valid, and in the non-critical region, HO will be valid. Now, same logic applies when we're doing left-tailed test. Alpha will be the area of the critical region on the left side. The value that separates critical and non-critical region from each other is the critical value. In the critical region, H1 will be valid, and in the non-critical region, HO will be valid. Now let's talk about testing methods. There are 2 commonly used methods when doing hypothesis testing: traditional method and the p-value method. Now, the conclusion by either method should be the same as the other method. Let's take a look at traditional method. We compute test statistic. When the test statistic falls in the non-critical region, that means HO is valid and H1 is invalid. We support the null hypothesis and we reject the alternative hypothesis. But when the test statistic falls in the critical region, then HO will be invalid and H1 will be valid. When HO is invalid, we reject it, and since H1 is valid, then we support it. Now the second method is called p-value method. When p-value is greater than alpha, HO is valid and H1 is invalid. Therefore, we support HO and we reject H1. But when p-value is less than or equal to alpha, then HO will be invalid and H1 will be valid. In that case, we're going to reject the null hypothesis and we're going to support the alternative hypothesis. Now, how do we express the final conclusion? If HO is the claim and HO is valid, we fail to reject the claim. But if HO is invalid, then we go ahead and reject the claim. The same thing applies if H1 is the claim. If H1 is valid, we fail to reject the claim. But if H1 is invalid, we should go ahead and reject the claim. I hope this brief presentation helped you understand the essentials of hypothesis testing and become familiar with some of the terminologies used in this topic.